Welcome to the Gospel of Matthew, Part 2, Lesson 3. And we are talking today about chapters 23 to 25. And Jesus is now in Jerusalem, and he's already provoked the powers that be in Jerusalem, the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and he's really going to town because he starts to denounce the elders and the Pharisees. And first he speaks to the crowds and reminds them of their hypocrisy and reminds the crowds and his disciples that these people are not the people who should be in charge. They are not the people they should be respecting and listening to. Talks about how they are always giving them unjust decisions, unjust ways of treating them, that they give them heavy burdens and they cheat them, and they are always not practicing what they preach, in a sense. And then he addresses the scribes and the Pharisees directly, and he says, "Woe to you, hypocrites, woe to you, hypocrites, woe to you, hypocrites," over and over again. And in the Psalms, most prominently, there are woe, right? Woe to the man who, or woe to the person who. And these kind of denunciations, therefore, would echo in the minds of the Pharisees themselves and the elders themselves, but also to the people who obviously were listening to Jesus's words. These words are very public, and also these denunciations and these words of woe, they're not really curses, but they are saying God's judgment is upon you. Beware, beware. And Jesus has some great insults in there. He calls them whitewashed sepulchers, that you look good on the outside, but they're rotten, dead things inside you, just decomposing. And it's like such a vivid image, right? Brood of vipers. These are just wonderful images that stick in your mind and are really insulting without cussing someone out, right? No one wants to be called a whitewashed tomb. I mean, these are great, great insults of Jesus. And you can see that Jesus tends not to call people sinners outright. He calls them hypocrites. He calls them evildoers. And I think one of the reasons Jesus does so is to give them a chance to convert, to turn back. Because if you are called, especially in Jesus's time, a sinner, that kind of makes you a complete outcast, and in a sense says that you are not worthy of salvation and that maybe you can't achieve salvation. But if you are a hypocrite, if you are an evildoer, that speaks to your actions, not to really who you are, right? A sinner speaks to your very nature, but hypocrisy and evil doing speaks to your actions, and you can change those, right? You can turn back to God and change how you act, how you think, not who you are per se. And so this series of denunciations always leaves the door open for these men to change. Now, who are the scribes and the Pharisees? Well, we have to realize that at the time of Jesus, Judea and the Galilee and the Jewish world were under theocracy. Even the Roman Empire was a theocracy, right? the religious leaders were the political leaders. And even though the Romans occupied Jewish territory and Judea and the Galilee, when it came to local matters, the Romans pretty much let the Jewish people run their own issues. So for things like blasphemy, for issues like troubles between neighbors, lawsuits, the Romans let Jewish law, which was also religious law, take precedence. They didn't have the power to execute someone, but they could decide who owed who what, who belonged in debtor's prison, who could be lashed, all these kinds of things. The Jewish authorities were allowed to do that because they were also the religious authorities. And it only was, like I said, the death penalty. Now, also if there was a riot or some kind of mob action, for example, with the woman who was caught in adultery, and that was a mob action, that was a crowd getting riled up. The Romans didn't have time to intervene, and they didn't really, as long as a Roman citizen wasn't involved, the Romans just kind of said, it was over one of their religious issues, we're going to leave it alone. So the scribes were lawyers. They basically were the lawyers. If you had some sort of dispute with your neighbor, you went to a scribe, and the scribe decided what the law said. They were the lawyers. Each person had a scribe where you went to the local scribe and you said, hey, my neighbor's goat ate part of my field. I want him to give me reparation. How much should he pay me? Or do I get to kill the goat and eat it? Those were the types of things they decided. And the scribes looked to the 615 laws of Moses and decided. That's what scribes did. And this is why scribes argued. They argued about the law and how to interpret these laws, especially for modern times, right? At the time of Jesus, there were situations that weren't addressed in the laws of Moses because times had changed, right? There were certain things that at Moses' times they didn't know how to address. That's who the scribes were. The Pharisees were a specific group of people, of men, who kept themselves in the strict purity that was needed to go worship in the temple at all times. So normally, it's almost like how you have to, or in traditional days, how you always had to put on your best clothes to attend church. Now we usually think of you put on your best clothes to attend a wedding, for example, or a funeral. Well, in my times, you always wore your best outfit to go to Mass, right? You dressed up. It was respectful. Well, in the same way, to go and worship at the temple, primarily for the big feasts like Passover, you had to be in a strict state of ritual purity. You had to cleanse yourself. You had to, like, women couldn't be on their periods, all these kinds of rules. And then you were clean, so to speak, in your best clothes to go worship at the temple. Well, the Pharisees maintained that kind of purity all the time, which was very difficult to do. There were all kinds of things you couldn't do, all kinds of things you couldn't touch, all kinds of washing you had to do regularly. And people really respected that. And the reason the Pharisees did that was to counteract, in a way, the defilement that the presence of the Romans brought into the land. And they were sort of trying to counteract that and bring holiness and salvation back to the people. Well, that's all well and good, but the other thing about the Pharisees was that they were all rich, right? Because you had to have servants do certain things, right? And women to do certain things, and slaves to do certain things, right? That you couldn't do, or you would not be able to maintain that strict level of purity at all times. Oh, that that pitcher is unclean. I'm not allowed to touch it, ever. Someone else has to touch it for me, or they have to make it clean before I can touch it. Now, regular people just, I'll use that, and then I'll go wash myself later, or whatever. So the Pharisees, people really looked up to them, but they had to be rich men, privileged men, to do this. And Jesus said they were hypocrites because they maintained outer purity, but it didn't mean they maintained inner purity. Their hearts, often they were Pharisees and kept this ritual purity, so people respected them and looked up to them and treated them well. Oh, yes, Rabbi so-and-so. Oh, let's cater to you. Let's defer to you. Oh, yes, you get the best seat in the synagogue. Oh, yes, you get a place of honor if you come to eat with me. And they liked, right? That puffed them up. They liked being treated so well. And Jesus said, you're hypocrites, because that's why you do it. You're all not doing it for the salvation of Israel and because the Romans were defiling the land. You're really doing it so everyone treats you well and you're honored and respected. And therefore, woe to you. And all the glory you get is the glory you get right here, because your heart's not true. Your reasons aren't pure. Now, obviously, you can see that these kinds of people being publicly shamed are not happy campers with Jesus. So again, hypocrisy is one of Jesus's big problems. And it makes sense, especially hypocrisy among religious authorities. And he's not just talking about the Jewish religious authorities. This is a message for every religious authority and anyone in authority. Because remember, the political authorities at his time were also the religious authorities. So this is across the board. Anyone with authority. And this just doesn't mean our political authorities or our factory, our bosses. This trickles all the way down to the family, right? You can't tell your kids, do as I say and not as I do, right? And my favorite example, just because it just shows, right, your kids watch you, is I remember my son when he was about 18 and he went to college, and college kids, right, party and stuff. And my husband and I said, well, when you party, be sure you don't drink and drive. And he said, I will never do it, and I have never done it, because when I was 11, you started talking to me about that kind of stuff, and I watched you guys like a hawk. And when we would go out to dinner, I watched to see if you guys drank even one drink and then drove. And you guys never did. When we went out to dinner, you always said to each other, well, honey, do you want a glass of wine or something? And one of you would always say, oh, well, if you want it, I don't want it because I have to drive. And he said, you never made a mistake. And that's because both of us experienced in our high school days some horrific, at our school, drunk driving accident where people died and had to go to jail, and it was awful. So we were both very strict about it. But he said, I watched, and never did you make a mistake, not once. So I knew you meant it when you told me not to do it. And it was like, wow, we didn't even realize this little kid's watching and paying attention, because he always seemed to be, playing on a Game Boy or arguing with his sister or whatever he was doing. But he was. And that's the kind of thing, even down to the family. Don't be a hypocrite. That's what Jesus is telling us. And then Jesus talks about, he laments. He's predicting when he laments to the women of Jerusalem and over Jerusalem, and then also predicts the destruction of the temple, we have to realize both that he's predicting when the Romans come in 70 AD after the first Jewish war, and Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed, or most of Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed. He's not just talking about the temple, in the physical temple, but he's also talking about himself, because he's the temple, right? He is the place of holiness and worship. And then we get to Jesus talking about the end of the world, which is the big question, right? And we understand the disciples saying, okay, Lord, you're talking about the end times. When is it coming? We want to know so we can be ready. And basically Jesus said, only God knows. Even Jesus said, only God knows. But we also always have to be ready. And I remember St. Pope John the 23rd always said, my bags are always packed. And that just means live the life of righteousness. Live as Jesus taught us to live. And then you don't have to fret. And then the day of the Lord is a happy day, because that's the day when peace and justice and love and the kingdom of God are fully realized, which is what we want, right? That's what we're waiting for. And then it's not scary. It's not going to be a problem. And Jesus says this one phrase that has been really misinterpreted, where he talks about there are two men in the field, and one is taken away and one stays, and two women grinding their flour, and one is taken away and one remains. And there are people who have taken that sort of out of context and talked about the rapture, and see this one man, this one woman are taken up bodily into heaven, and there is the rapture, and see, this is one of the one of the lines in the Bible that proves it. Except for one thing, how do we know that the person taken away isn't being taken away for judgment, and the person staying behind isn't being left for righteousness? The text isn't really very clear about this. So we can't necessarily interpret this as rapture. And I mean, that's only one issue with the rapture, and I'm not going to get into it here. But this is ambiguous. Jesus isn't very clear that the good person is the one taken away. We don't know. And then we have the parable of the 10 virgins. And I remember with their oil lamps. And I remember as a little kid going, wow, those 10 wise virgins are kind of mean. You're supposed to share. And if you have people in a dire situation, you're supposed to share with them. You're not supposed to say, no, go get your own. But this is a metaphor. And the oil is not about a physical product. It's really about your faith and your trust in the Lord and how you live in response to that. And you can't give that to someone else. You can't just say, oh yeah, here you go, take some of mine. You can only say, oh, quick, yeah, go and develop your own and get that faith in God and then live in response. You can't really say that to someone, right? It's intangible. And so that's what Jesus is talking about, that people need to be listening to what they're supposed to be doing. And it's about what you're doing and not necessarily what you say. Again, that's hypocrisy, but it's about what you're doing and how you're living your life in response to God's love. And that can take many forms and many ways of understanding, but that's the wisdom. That's the wisdom. And then we have the parable of the talents. And Yes, on one level, it definitely means what we've been taught, which is that God gives us talents and we are supposed to use them for good in the world. I'm not going to say that is wrong. However, I am going to give a new way to look at it. And that is, again, the earthly way, the way it might have been understood by the people of Jesus' time. So we have a landowner. And as I spoke about in the previous lesson, at the time of Jesus, the landowners were the bad guys. They were not God, right? These were the land grabbers. These were the robber barons. These were, as the Irish thought, boo, hiss, the British overlords. These were slave owners, however you want to imagine them. Boo, hiss, bad guys, not God. And so our translations usually say the stewards or the servants. That word in Koine Greek only means slaves. Only translation possible. Forever and ever, always, always, every dictionary, lexicon I've ever looked at, only one translation: slaves. These are this guy's slaves. Now, because the landowner entrusts them with money, because talents are actually money, they're not physical talents like God gives us, but money. They are very highly trusted slaves. They are very high up in his household because they are entrusted with money. These slaves are entrusted with money. Now, as we recall, how did this landowner get his money and get his land? He loaned money to people at loan shark loans, right? Up to 800% interest. We would say mobsters do this, right? This is the kind of thing a mobster would give, that kind of loan to someone who was desperate. Now, this landowner goes off and he has given 3 of his trusted slaves some of his money. Now, what the slaves do with their money, their various amounts, how do they double the money, the first 2 guys? They give loan shark loans too, right? How else are they going to double the money? I mean, if you think about it, if someone tells you, I can double your money in such and such a time, they're either lying to you or they're going to do something illegal with your money, right? Come on. Nothing is that good. And so how are they going to do it? They're going to do loan shark loans. Now, one of the things about the first century was slaves, especially higher up slaves who are entrusted with money, there was kind of a wink-wink understanding that when a landowner or a slave owner who entrusted slaves with money wanted them to invest his money, he knew that as long as they doubled his money, anything over that amount, the slave was allowed to keep. It was sort of this, yeah, you don't have to give me more than double my money. You can keep anything over and above. Kind of like tax collectors, right? They just had to give the Romans their taxes, and then they could keep anything over that amount, which is why everyone hated them, because they knew they were overcharging and pocketing the rest. The same was true here. And one of the big reasons the slaves did this was because after a while they would get enough money to buy themselves out of slavery. So that's what the first 2 guys do. They take the landowner's money, give loan shark loans to desperate people, double the money, and probably make more for themselves. What does the last guy do? He buries the money. He doesn't give a loan shark loan. He doesn't even put it in a bank. Why? Because he's refusing to participate in this system of exploitation of poor people, of poor, desperate people. He won't take their money. He won't extort them. He won't cheat them. This is his only way of saying no. And he pays a high price for that. And the reason we can see why you can interpret it in this manner is when the landowner comes back, what does the servant or the slave who buried the money say? I knew you were a hard man who reaped where you did not sow. That means you took money and land that didn't belong to you. If you reap where you do not sow, you collect gains that you did not earn. And he said, I knew you were that guy. I was afraid of you. Are we supposed to be afraid of God? Yes, we always hear fear of the Lord, but that kind of fear is awe of the Lord. It's not terror of the Lord, right? We're not supposed to be terrorized by God, right? We're supposed to be in awe of God. It's sort of like in Russian, like we always hear about the Tsar Ivan the Terrible, but it literally means in Russian, Ivan the Awesome, the awe-inspiring. So it's fearsome, but in the sense of awe. Even though, yeah, he was a bad guy. It's in that way, the analogy doesn't completely work, but the language does. Fear of the Lord is awe of the Lord, not terror of the Lord, right? God doesn't terrorize us. However, this landowner terrorized people, right? And the last slave who buries the money is terrorized by this guy. And the guy, as a terrorist, boots him out, makes him suffer. And so this guy, this last slave, is showing the cost of discipleship, which is, yeah, you don't participate in the unjust system. The unjust system punishes you like the unjust system will punish Jesus. But he did the right thing. And that's the other way you can look at this parable. You can still interpret it the way we've always heard, which is on sort of the divine level. We have to use the gifts God gives us. But on the other level, on kind of a more earthly level, the level of the human context, it's also about not participating in an unjust system, even if we have to pay a price, a personal price for it. Because if enough of us do, we can change that unjust system, right? If enough of us refuse to be greedy and selfish and participate in that, it changes. That's how change happens. I think we're good here. Yep. So again, hypocrisy is denounced because that's always part of the system. And Jesus calls us to imitate him, because in our next section, we're going to see how Jesus pays that price for fighting that unjust system. But we are always called to imitate Jesus, be like him, and work to dismantle the unjust system. Thank you.